Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Hi, my name is Amelia, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about BGSU Votes. BGSU Votes is a nonpartisan student-led initiative that focuses on increasing civic and democratic engagement among college students. The next election is May 5th, and it's a primary election. To vote in this election, people must register by April 6, 2026. In the fall, there's an upcoming election November 3rd. To vote in this election, people must register by October 5th, 2026.
Welcome aboard, everyone, to another episode of Democracy Exchange with The Depot. I am your host, Connor Hand, and today we are sitting down with Dr. Savitri Kunze, who is an assistant professor of history at BGSU. We'll be discussing America's 250th anniversary and human rights and international sovereignty in America. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So for our first question here, what historical benefit do you find in this being America's 250th anniversary?
So I think that there's a few things. I think anniversaries give us space to think about history and allow us to consider how we got here. There's a lot of different understandings of like what's happening in this moment from a civics perspective, right? Like American civics is at its all-time low, says a variety of different surveys, right? And so I think it gives us a moment to reflect on what that means, right? And how do we have a chance to course correct a little bit, right? And so through the Civic 250 Scholars, for example, we have a chance to engage with teachers from K to 12 and actually get them to think about this moment, how to teach the documents that are important to this country's history, both in terms of civics institutions, but also in terms of understanding and contextualizing them from a historical perspective.
Thank you. And I see we see in Ohio a lot of push for a lot more civics education. Do you think that's beneficial for freshmen coming into college as one of the ways to fix this problem of a lack of civics in our education?
That's an interesting question, right? Because I think I'm always pro having a greater civic education for students on the one hand, right? But on the other hand, I think that having specific documents that are mandated by politicians rather than experts in the field of civics bears a lot of risk, right? One example is that according to the new or Senate Bill 1, what was formerly known as Senate Bill 1, you have to teach 5 of the Federalist Papers. And so I love to use the Federalist Papers as an example because the Federalist Papers were really important in New York, right? They were making an argument to the citizens of New York that New York should ratify the Constitution. They were not relevant necessarily for the rest of the country. They were pieces that were designed to persuade. So to treat them then as enduring symbols of the thoughts that Americans had about civic institutions indefinitely takes them out of their moment entirely and actually misreads them pretty fundamentally. And so I'm not even against using those 5 documents, but to do so and expect students to understand the civic implications of them without contextualizing that knowledge, I think bears a few risks. And that's where I would have liked in the new civic education mandates that there might have been a little bit more engagement from different scholars who have studied civics and have thought through how we can better teach students this knowledge.
Thank you. And so I guess talking more in the historical lens of it, how can students, faculty look at the 250th anniversary between history and civics and one of these historical lenses? So would you say adding more context is kind of the key piece there?
As a historian, I always want more context. So I think that you can't understand any piece of any historic document without that context. To do so would be to take it as it was written verbatim, right? And so which I think erases the author's intent, the specific audience, right? Why the document was written. All questions that historians ask, right, as they encounter any primary text. to treat it like it stands in stone rather than as something that existed within history, I think misses a lot of points.
Okay, thank you. And so one of your classes recently, you had students connect some of the historical events you were learning in class with current events that were ongoing in the United States. What were some of the key takeaways that students found from this class and from doing those activities in class?
Totally. I love so it's what I call hot topics, which like whatever, it's a kind of a kitschy name, but I ask that students bring an article to class, and so they'll post into discussion board and explain in a couple sentences how this article relates to class. And this is partly just so everybody has access to the same material so that they can actually reference it. And I think consistently when I do this assignment, it's one of my favorite for upper level classes. Everybody is so surprised at how much relates to the histories we're learning. So for example, for my Cold War class, any of the many events that are happening that where the U.S. interacts with Russia are relevant, or like any of our negotiations with China over different trade deals are relevant and like can connect back to to Nixon's opening of China or any other things. And you can see these echoes across history. I wouldn't necessarily call them parallels, but these are recurring topics that I think it's very challenging to understand the present without having that historical context. I'm just going to continue to return to historical context. Yeah. And so I think students are so surprised by how many echoes exist.
That's fascinating. And I've done a couple similar things in classes before, but I don't think ever to that degree where everyone is kind of communicating together with that. So did you find that when your students discussed this in class that they were really sharing and connecting, or I guess making further connections between the different events that they were studying in the modern day? Or were they more so finding like from a specific article different connections back in the past?
I think both to a certain degree. I think that the way it's designed is to hopefully encourage students to not just bring in anything random, right? But for example, if we're thinking about the history of American imperialism or like settler colonization, and a student brings in like a local water issue where a city is appropriating land for a water plant, this has a lot of resonance, right, with different, with like Native American removal, for example. And so I'm trying to think of like a specific example. I was looking over my Canvas site, and for some reason I can't see the when I've actually used it. But I think that there's more connection from I think the things that generated the most connections were surrounding the Cold War and linking it to the present. I mean, so many op-eds have called this like a new Cold War, which I honestly don't love as a terminology, but because again, there's like key differences. We're in a multipolar world versus like the singular, like the bipolarity of the Cold War is a defining feature of it. But nonetheless, like you can see the antagonistic relationship between the U.S. and Russia as having many similarities in certain ways.
Thank you. And if we could move on to some of your research. So you've done research into human rights and international sovereignty in the early 1900s, specifically on the United States and the different policies that they had kind of relating to immigration and deportation. Although not a one-to-one comparison, do you find many links between America's historical struggle with these topics and the present day?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that you don't necessarily expect as a historian is like when your research becomes like increasingly relevant over time. I was doing research at the National Archives during Trump's first term when I was unable to go back because Trump shut down the government to fund the border wall, which is like such a weird moment where like I'm literally researching deportation and the rights of deportees when Trump then prevents the ongoing research because of the border wall. But I don't know, that's just like one example. But one of the focuses in my research is like, what rights do people who don't have access to citizenship have, right? Like this is a question. Like most of our rights are based in citizenship to some country. And so if you lack that to access to a country's protection, what does that leave you? And so this is the case, especially during World War I and in between World War I and World War II, where people can't claim proper citizenship, and the U.S. says that they don't want them for some reason, right? Like for whatever reason that they determine, right? But then where do we send them, right? Like there's what country, part of what deportation means is having to have international foreign relations. Like you can't determine that a person is undesirable and then just put them on the other side of the border. You have to send them somewhere. At the other side of the border, you have to get Canada or Mexico to agree to take those people, right? And so that's like the central conundrum, right, of what I look at. And you can see that in an ongoing way of like, what do we do with humans that the United States government has determined, for whatever reason, don't fit? If they don't meet certain criteria, right? So we can think back to the children, unaccompanied minors who came across the border. It's like, what do we do with those children who do not have the same identification, who do not have access to their parents anymore after they were separated from them? Like, what rights do those children have, and what responsibilities does the U.S. government have to them, while also upholding its constitutional values, right?
Right. Thank you. And that's extremely fascinating research. And I wanted to ask, because another thing that I read was that you analyzed a lot of the differences between America's policies, and they're very conflicting during this time period. Do you find that was kind of very endemic back then, or maybe still something that we see today with conflicting policies? I'm thinking at the very least between administrations.
Totally. Yeah. So for my research, there's a lack of communication at like a pretty core level. So the State Department would say one thing, and then the Department of Labor, who is then in charge of immigration and deportation, would say a different thing, and there would be and the judicial branch would just say an entirely separate thing, and then none of them talked to one another, and so they were all just operating in separate planes, and saying that this is actually my territory. You don't have any jurisdiction, where everybody else disagreed. And so you can kind of see that today also, where there are people who are specialists in foreign policy or work for the State Department are saying one thing, or saying like, do not antagonize this one government, we do not want that. And then someone who works for the Department of Homeland Security is accidentally antagonizing said government. And so you can see that kind of thing happening. I'm not sure necessarily at the like broader policy level, but part of what I'm looking at in my research is the impact of bureaucrats, right? Because I think that there's a lot of histories that focus on the much sexier titled positions, like the actual secretaries of state or the presidency, or any of the people that whose names you might know. But on a day-to-day level, it's bureaucrats of some kind who are making policy work on the ground. And so we can see this today, for example, in the expansion of ICE, right? Like which has received a lot of coverage in the news, where it's like, those are people who just work for the government. They are not the makers of policy. And so what role do they play in actually what policy looks like is the decisions that they make. And so that gap between like policy maker and policy executor is really something that I think continues to be important to look at.
That's a bit of a timeless, I suppose, element between back then and now. Yeah. Thank you. And so, I mean, historical problems are very complex and often extremely different to our modern day. But from your research, were there any solutions that they ended up coming with? Was there better communication maybe between these branches, or perhaps more direct lines of communication between policymakers and policy executioners, as you say? Do you happen to see that towards the end of your research, or is there really nothing there?
I mean, I don't think that there's necessarily solutions per se, right? But there are lessons we can draw, right? So for example, that just better communication is helpful in enacting if you want a policy to be successful. Because I think that what history does is it shows what has been tried and like what within those circumstances, which are relatively narrow, right, can be more and less successful. So I think I found a variety of very ad hoc solutions in my research. For example, there's a case, there's like a particularly famous case after the Palmer raids, and this is from 1919 to 1920. And so during the Palmer raids, the Attorney General went around and arrested hundreds to thousands of people, right? And these are suspected anarchists, radicals, but many of whom have Russian origin. Most of whom are eventually released. They had, in fact, no anarchist tendencies. They just were Russian or belonged to a labor union. There were some Americans that were arrested. But they kept about 250 people. And these 250 people are put aboard a ship and sent, it's called the Buford or the Soviet Ark, and sent to Russia, right? And so they find that they can't send these people directly to Russia because there's no recognition with the Russian government. And so they need to find solutions on the ground. So they at first attempt to route them through Latvia, but there are huge protests happening in Latvia during the time, and so that particular route falls through. And so instead, this is like while they're literally on a ship sailing, right? They get rerouted to Finland through an elaborate negotiations, food aid, a variety of other conditions that are imposed. And so basically this is a diplomatic game of telephone. So the Finns ask the Estonians to tell the Bolsheviks that some people would cross the border into Russian territory. And so eventually Americans get the deportees, ask them to disembark, and then walk them from the Finnish border to the Russian border, right? They are picked up by the Russians. And so this example, right, like this is like a sort of a weird story. It shows how deportation isn't just like a domestic decision, right? This is like a process that's dependent on foreign cooperation, on domestic cooperation. And so taking that, I think it helps us better understand how policies today interact with the world, right? Like that they're not just about America or about Americans, right? Like that they require diplomacy, right? And so this is just one anecdote, right? Yeah. But you can see how like what like the assumptions that we make about the Palmer raids, for example, it's like a huge government use of power, arresting thousands of people, many claiming huge governmental overreach. And so but in fact, the government did not actually have the power to do a lot of that deportation. They could not send people directly to Russia. Yeah. And so thinking about that example, it shows us a few things, right? It shows that like you need that deportation, for example, is an act of foreign relations. Like, and deportation can't be successful without those foreign relations. It shows the use of a third-party country, which like the term third-party country has become like is a particularly relevant one for deportation, particularly since the 90s. It's a term that's used within like the deportation policy itself. Yeah. And it shows like how people on the ground are trying to work to enact, to actually follow the law, even if it's through something as strange as walking someone physically across a border. And like, what does that mean? Like, what does the law mean? I think like I talk about this a lot in my early America classes, right? Where like we study things like the fugitive slave law, and I point to it as saying like this was the law, like this is what the law is. And so if we think that this is the law and we think of law, we want to follow laws, right, to complete our social pact. What does it mean when there's something like the fugitive slave law on the books? And so like how might that help us understand how laws are created by humans and like how we can think through them?
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And then I was wondering, talking about those laws and specifically the laws of deportation, how far out, I suppose, in the 20th century does your research extend to?
So I look to 1933, which is when the U.S. formally provided diplomatic recognition for Russia. It's a slightly challenging thing because I might extend it as I continue to work on my book project. I might extend it further, but the challenge is World War II and Nazi Germany, which utterly changes the landscape of what citizenship and deportation looks like, and the consequences of both. And so I try to avoid, or I'm still deciding honestly of what to do with this, but more or less from the 1870s through 1930s.
All right, well, thank you very much. And for our viewers who are interested in looking more into human rights or international sovereignty, do you have any resources you might recommend they check out?
So I would recommend a couple works. One is by Mark Mazauer, his work is called No Enchanted Palace. It talks about the building of the UN. And I think it's a really interesting history that makes us think about how international organizations function and the actual people involved in making them come about. And the other is by a historian named Mark Philip Bradley, and it's called A World Reimagined. And he's doing a history of human rights that considers the importance of human rights from cultural and social as well as political angles. And I think those two works are really accessible for broad readership, and I think are interesting as well.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down with us today. That'll conclude our episode. I do want to express a massive thank you to the Depot social media team, production crews. So that's going to be Bryce Torres, Julia Amlin, Bryn Drabeck, Jack Cullen, and Caleb Elkovich. I'd also like to give a massive thank you to our founder, Dr. Robert Alexander. And I've been your host and researcher, Connor Hand. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Democracy Exchange with the Depot. Bye for now.
Voting can be a complicated process, but it doesn't have to be. You have several options whether you're a college student or whoever you are. You can vote early at your Board of Elections before the election period. This can vary depending on the Board of Elections, so please look up your Board of Elections hours for early voting. You could also vote by mail or absentee voting. So you have to request an absentee ballot and then you send that into your Board of Elections. Or you can vote in person on election day. If you are a college student, you can register to vote with your permanent at-home address or your student address on campus. Here at BGSU, we have a student polling location in the Student Union on election day.